1. The spray spewed almost 15 feet into the air as the surf rolled into a curl nearly that high. White foam slammed against the sand, and the bubbles raced up the beach toward the umbrellas and lounge chairs filled mostly with Canadians, something Caleb wouldn't have guessed until he'd been here for a few days. He wondered if everyone in Vancouver picked up in January and moved to the western coast of Mexico. Given the perfect weather in Jalisco, Caleb couldn't blame them. Why stick around someplace with negative temperatures? He'd never been to Puerto Vallarta before he and Amanda traveled across Mexico. When he found out so much of the tourist and expat population was from Canada, he was relieved. In fact, he had an alias that fit right in. Roland Breyer of Toronto. The passport was virginal, but the conditions offered a perfect reason to break it in. It would be easier to pass Amanda off as Canadian than it would most other nationalities. With any luck, as she grew up, her speech would develop just enough of an odd accent to throw off most people. And as long as she didn't sound like she was born in Augusta, Georgia, he felt she'd be safer. The breeze came along the beach, passing under the pier, as he carried a large wooden tray through the crowded waterfront. Mounds of oysters and ice piled up on the platter. A leather strap wrapped over his shoulders, helping him carry the nearly 70 pounds of shellfish. Ostras. Quien quiere ostras frescas, he called in Spanish before repeating in English, oysters. Who wants fresh oysters? An older fellow with an Ernest Hemingway beard and a stiff tan Panama hat waved. 3 women, evenly bronzed by the Mexican sun, stretched out in lounge chairs around him. None of them seemed as if they should be with the man, except for their age. They were all fit, thin, and surgically enhanced. He, on the other hand, sported the same deep brown skin, but beer crafted his gut. Caleb lifted an eyebrow at the tiny pink swim briefs the man wore, which left nothing to the imagination, and little for the guy to show off. The water is cold, Caleb considered. Dos docinas, Hemingway said. Caleb seemed to drop the salver, but he jerked it up suddenly. 2 legs flopped out from the bottom as he rose. His right foot adjusted both braces to hold the table, and Caleb pulled a small, dull blade from his waist. The oyster knife was practically homemade. More like home-repaired, Caleb thought. The round metal tip jutted from a hand grip fashioned from melted acrylic. Caleb assumed someone along the way created a mold for the thick bulb of a handle, and heated scraps of trash until it liquefied. It would be easy to set the alloy blade and pour the mixture into the cast. Whatever they did, it made a serviceable shucking knife. With his left hand, Caleb snapped a towel off his belt and wrapped an oyster before nestling the tool into the hinge. He rotated his wrist, gently opening the crack slightly wider. A second later, the metal edge pried the shells apart. Caleb scraped the side of the tool under the muscle to sever it from the bottom shell. He repeated the process 23 times, dropping the top shell into a bag hanging off the table and setting the half filled with meat on a paper dish. Before he handed Hemingway his oysters, Caleb pulled a whole lime from his pocket, slicing it into quarters and adding 2 pieces to each platter of shellfish. Hot sauce? He asked, pulling a small vial of red liquid from a makeshift holster on his belt. Yes, please, the bearded man agreed. Caleb spun the bottle, passing it to him, watching as Hemingway doused the oysters with the spicy red liquid. He handed it back with 400 pesos. Gracias. Caleb responded with a nod. Hemingway returned the gesture as he lifted an oyster to his lips and slurped it out of the shell. Caleb holstered his sauce and knife, looped the towel on his belt, and hoisted the table up. The legs sprang up, and he used his knees to push them against the bottom of the tray. Caleb wondered when his skin would brown as much as Hemingway's and his lady's had. He spent 6 hours a day lugging oysters up and down La Playa de los Muertos, which translated to the Beach of the Dead. It was an unusual name, but it stemmed from when the city's earlier inhabitants built a cemetery somewhere on this stretch of coast. The graves had long since vanished, although Caleb wasn't sure if it was intentional or simply the fact that building a graveyard in the sand along the Pacific Ocean was a terrible idea. The weather in Puerto Vallarta had one setting, unless it was hurricane season, sunny with about 7 puffy billows in the sky. Caleb instinctively glanced upward at the 3 clouds drifting behind the Los Muertos pier, a strange-looking spire sticking up from the concrete platform. The structure reminded Caleb of an Art Deco fan, and he half expected it to rotate every time he looked at it. The edge of the pier remained crowded at almost all times. He'd never been down here after midnight, but he suspected that, like the rest of the city, it never really slept. The sun glinted off the sand, and despite the cheap aviator shades he got from Carlos, the sunglasses man who peddled his array of eyewear along the shore, Caleb squinted. These aviators might not have been of the highest quality. "It's what I get for 120 pesos, Caleb considered. He had grown accustomed to thinking in terms of the Mexican currency instead of dollars. It was an old habit, blending into whatever culture in which he was located. It almost surprised him how easily he reverted to operational mode. Maybe, he contemplated, he never left it. Although after a few years with Audrey, he felt more at ease. Caleb convinced himself he'd let his guard down. Perhaps it just never needed to rear up. He lowered his head, letting the brim of the straw hat shade his face as he scanned the crowds for more customers. Most of the beachgoers held a special tolerance to the many vendors, hawking everything from massages and hair braids to dresses and artwork. Caleb noticed that while the guys traipsed up and down offering stuff, most took being turned down pretty easily. When someone wanted something, they learned to seek out the vendor with it. He was an expert at watching mannerisms anyway. He knew which tourists were interested in buying and which weren't. The expats and visiting Canadians loved supporting the vendors, and those were easy to spot. The cruise ship people, on the other hand, held their wallets tightly, afraid the brown folks might make off with their cash. Of course, he figured that was part of the cruise ship warnings: don't take all your money ashore because it's safer to spend it on board. The same was true for the all-inclusive crowd that sneaked off the resorts to dip their toes in the culture. They bought nothing outside of a taco or some weed. Sand shifted through his sandals as he shuffled along. He paused when he saw the man in the baseball cap. It wasn't the New York Giants hat that caught his eye. He slouched in a plastic chair with a can of Pacifico. Everything about the man screamed American, and to Caleb, everything about the man also screamed killer. If asked what caused him to classify the character that way, Caleb might not have been able to pinpoint the details. The knowledge was innate, an uncanny sixth sense. He rotated around and walked back down the beach. Caleb used the edge of his sunglasses as a mirror to study the man. The angle distorted the reflection, but it provided him with the detail he needed. He wore a typical tropical-style button shirt with shorts. Caleb put him in his 30s, closer to 30 than 40. He was by himself, and while that wasn't reason enough, it set off a few alarms. Very few travelers visited Puerto Vallarta alone. They came with friends, spouses, significant others. Or they met people here, too many friendlies to leave a stranger sitting by themselves. It was the bane of the place for Caleb. A man who wanted to go along in life unnoticed didn't do so well when every day someone tried to strike up another conversation. This guy avoided that. There wasn't an extra seat for a friend to come later. He also positioned himself so he could watch both the shore and the walkway leading back to Basilio Badillo, the closest street feeding directly to the sand. He was on the prowl. Caleb knew the look of a hunter. He'd been one long enough to know the telltale signs. "Can I get a dozen?" A voice interrupted his thoughts. He glanced up to see an older man and his wife reclining in the Adirondack chairs under an umbrella. This wasn't a local tourist, as Caleb came to refer to them. Those were the ones who were here for months on end. This guy was only here for a few days. Neither he nor his spouse had the tan of weeks on the beach. Instead, both were pinkish from a few too many hours in the sun. Caleb dropped his table down and started shucking oysters. He glanced over his shoulder as he worked. The Giants fan turned his head toward Caleb for an instant. If he hadn't been wearing the cheap shades, Caleb would have locked eyes with the man. They held the gaze for less than a second, but to an operator like Caleb, it was an eternity. The man stood up, dropping a small wad of colored bills on the table. He moved in Caleb's direction, and every fiber in Caleb's body tensed up. Past training ignited, and Caleb's breathing steadied as he moved. The eyes behind the tinted glasses narrowed, and Caleb prepared. The Marine Corps and, ultimately, the Office of Compliance instilled that preparation in him. They trained it into him as a kid. A lifetime before today, Caleb Saunders departed Paris Island to be recruited into the Office of Compliance. He had an innate talent for killing, and the United States government didn't want to waste him in the Marine Corps when they could wind him up and aim him to the targets they wanted eliminated. Caleb knew he had a gift for it, and he considered it part of his civic responsibility. At 18, he took a Greyhound from the tiny burg of Clayton, Georgia, with every intention of fighting for his country. At the time, Caleb only wished to follow in his grandfather's footsteps by joining the Marines. From his perspective, being a Marine meant he only had to kill out of duty. When Carl Winston gave him the codename Corsair and put him to work for the Office of Compliance, he thought he was still doing just that. Until Turkey. Turkey changed everything. The information his handler passed along to him stated the apartment was the headquarters of an Al-Qaeda cell. The mission was almost rote work, simple compared to others he'd accomplished. Set off an explosion to make it look like they'd accidentally blown themselves up. Fate forced his hand. The device malfunctioned, and Corsair never left a job unfinished. He moved inside the building to take out the cell, only to find the targets were a 29-year-old woman and her 7-year-old son. At first, Corsair thought it had been a mistake, but somewhere deep in his gut he knew otherwise. The boy had a bounty on his head. He was the illegitimate son of a Turkish leader whose enemies targeted the kid to scare the Turk into a political deal. Caleb sent the woman and her son running before blowing the apartment up. His bosses in the OOC presumed he died in the explosion. 10 years passed and he enjoyed being dead. Until one day, 2 thugs resurrected Corsair. Right now, Corsair stuck his head out of Caleb's subconscious. He studied the giant's fan as he moved toward him. Caleb's grip on the oyster knife shifted as he finished up the dozen oysters. His mind played out 6 different points on the man where he could kill him with one jab of the dull blade. The neck, stab into the jugular. Either eye. The back of the skull, right into the brainstem. The liver. Worst case, he could put it into the man's leg, rupturing the femoral artery. The New Yorker came closer, but he had made no threatening moves yet. Corsair waited as Caleb plated the oysters. When the American passed him without glancing his direction, Caleb handed the shellfish to the tourist and his wife. Before the couple could pay him, Caleb popped the legs up on the table and turned to watch the giant's fan as he walked off toward the wooden walkway that led to the pier and street. Caleb paused, watching the individual he knew was a killer trail behind a young woman strolling along the road.